The first light of June 5, 1944, barely touches the rolling waves of the English Channel. Fog drifts like ghostly fingers over the water, hiding the thousands of vessels poised to strike Normandy's beaches. Across the Channel, in a command tent in southern England, General Dwight D. Eisenhower studies his maps, every contour a possible gateway to victory or disaster. In London, Winston Churchill leans against the war room's cold stone wall, listening to distant air raid sirens, a city that has survived the Blitz yet braces for the next thunder. Somewhere in the French countryside, tanks and trucks rattle softly, General George S. Patton's men unaware of the precise moment they will surge forward, their speed and audacity about to shock friend and foe alike. Deep in Berlin, Adolf Hitler is surrounded by generals echoing his delusions of control, blind to the storm massing on the western horizon. Across these separate worlds, tension coils like a spring. In a single night, the decisions of four men will set the course of continents, and the shape of history itself will hang in the balance. By the spring of 1944, Europe had already endured nearly 5 years of relentless war. Germany's early blitzkrieg campaigns had stunned the world. Poland fell in September 1939, France in June 1940, and much of Western Europe had been reshaped under Hitler's control. The Luftwaffe had been halted over Britain, but the Battle of Britain had left scars on cities and civilians alike. On the Eastern Front, German armies were locked in a brutal struggle with the Soviet Union, a grinding conflict that drained men and materiel in a way few Western observers could fully grasp. Meanwhile, the Allies were consolidating. In North Africa, General George S. Patton had proven his mastery of armored warfare, pushing Rommel's Afrika Korps back across the desert. Eisenhower had risen steadily through the ranks, trusted by both Roosevelt and Churchill to coordinate large-scale operations. The United States, having fully mobilized after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, was pouring soldiers, ships, and aircraft into Europe. Britain, battered but unbowed, remained the nerve center of the Allied war effort, with Churchill's indomitable presence keeping morale high, despite the ever-present threat of German air raids and espionage. Amid these movements, planning for the invasion of occupied France had already begun in earnest. Operation Overlord was more than a military campaign. It was a complex orchestration of thousands of ships, landing craft, paratroopers, and air support. Intelligence officers mapped every inlet and bluff of the French coast. Counterintelligence sought to mislead the Germans at every turn. Every officer, from the highest commander to the platoon leader, knew the stakes. Failure could prolong the war indefinitely. But in Berlin, Hitler remained confident in the strength of his Atlantic Wall, convinced that any invasion could be repelled with calculated rigidity. The clash of these opposing visions was approaching, and the men who would define the moment, Patton, Eisenhower, Churchill, and Hitler, were already positioning themselves for the decisive phase of the conflict. By early 1944, Germany's grip on Europe showed cracks, but Hitler's confidence remained unshaken. The Atlantic Wall, a vast system of bunkers, obstacles, and minefields stretching from Norway to the French coast, was meant to repel any Allied landing. Coastal defenses were reinforced with artillery and mechanized units, yet intelligence reports suggested uneven troop strength and low morale among the German divisions stationed in France. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his Berlin bunker, dismissed repeated warnings from generals urging flexibility. He clung to rigid defensive doctrines, convinced that the Allies could be blunted by sheer fortification. Across the Channel, Allied preparations accelerated. The buildup in southern England was monumental. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of ships, and hundreds of aircraft massed under tight secrecy. Paratroopers trained for night drops. Amphibious units rehearsed on beaches that mirrored the French coast. Patton, despite being sidelined from the initial assault, was instrumental in Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would strike Pas de Calais. Eisenhower, meanwhile, weighed every risk, balancing the need for bold action with the logistical reality of coordinating multiple nations, languages, and military doctrines. Churchill worked behind the scenes, lobbying for full American participation while keeping Britain's war-weary population focused and resolute. The human cost of these preparations was immense. Soldiers trained relentlessly, facing injuries, exhaustion, and the constant uncertainty of whether they would survive the first day on hostile soil. Intelligence officers pored over reconnaissance photos, decoding the German defenses, while engineers designed bridges, landing craft, and vehicles capable of traversing the beaches. Every decision, every late-night meeting, and every adjustment in troop placement carried consequences that would ripple across the continent. As the Allies honed their plans, Hitler's overconfidence in fixed defenses and rigid command chains set the stage for disaster. The collision of strategy, technology, and human will was inevitable. Across Europe, the leaders who would define this moment, Patton, Eisenhower, Churchill, and Hitler, were already shaping the battlefield in ways that would decide the fate of nations. Their visions, separate yet destined to intersect, were about to converge on one fateful morning. June 6, 1944. Just before dawn, the English Channel trembles with movement. Thousands of Allied ships, from massive troop transports to nimble landing craft, cut through the mist toward the beaches of Normandy. In the skies above, paratroopers descend into the dark, their silhouettes barely visible, tasked with seizing key bridges and disrupting German communications. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, seated in his command post in southern England, monitors the progress through radio reports, the weight of every life resting on his decisions. Hours earlier, he had issued the final order, "Okay, let's go." A phrase so simple, yet carrying the full responsibility of millions. On the ground, chaos and courage intertwine. Soldiers face a barrage of machine gun fire, artillery shells, and obstacles designed to kill. At Omaha in Utah, waves of men struggle through surf and shrapnel. In contrast, British and Canadian forces push inland at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, meeting fierce resistance but slowly gaining ground. Meanwhile, General George S. Patton, having orchestrated the deception campaign that convinced Hitler the main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, watches as his men prepare to exploit the breakthrough. His armored divisions are ready to surge forward, their timing critical to sustaining momentum once the beachheads are secure. In Berlin, Hitler remains in the Führerbunker, distracted by reports from the Eastern Front. Orders to reinforce Normandy are delayed, and commanders on the ground hesitate to act without explicit authorization. This paralysis grants the Allies the precious hours they need. Across the Channel, naval gunfire pounds German fortifications, while landing craft discharge waves of soldiers, tanks, and supplies onto heavily defended beaches. Every minute is a test of nerve, planning, and improvisation. The morning unfolds like a carefully choreographed storm, yet unpredictability reigns. Units are scattered, communications falter, and leadership at every level adapts on the fly. Despite the slaughter, small victories accumulate. Key positions are taken, exits from the beaches secured, and German defenses begin to buckle under relentless pressure. The four visions, Eisenhower's coordination, Patton's strategic deception, Churchill's insistence on commitment, and Hitler's stubborn rigidity, collide in this crucible, shaping the course of history in real time. By mid-June 1944, the beaches of Normandy had been secured, but the battle had only begun. Eisenhower's carefully orchestrated plans hinged on speed and coordination. Allied forces, reinforced by follow-on waves of troops and equipment, pushed inland, moving toward Cherbourg and the Bocage country of Normandy. General Patton, now unleashed from the ruse of Operation Fortitude, led his Third Army in a lightning advance across France, exploiting every weakness in German lines. His movements were bold, sometimes reckless, but decisive, armored columns cutting deep, bridges captured before demolition, towns liberated in rapid succession. Hitler's response, constrained by command rigidity, was lethally slow. Panzer divisions that could have countered the Allied advance were held in reserve, awaiting orders that never came. Communications between the front and the Führerbunker were fragmented, leaving field commanders paralyzed. The German defensive network, formidable in theory, began to unravel. Artillery fire, once dominant on the beaches, became sporadic. Supply lines crumbled under relentless Allied pressure. The German soldiers, demoralized and disoriented, struggled to regroup. In London, Churchill receives the first reports of breakthroughs. He is both relieved and calculated, knowing that sustaining momentum will be key to eventual victory. Strategic decisions made weeks earlier, the mobilization of the Royal Air Force, the prepositioning of reinforcements, and the coordination with American and Canadian forces, now pay dividends. Air supremacy allows bombers to strike German positions inland, supporting Patton's armored thrusts and safeguarding supply convoys along the coast. The hours and days that follow define a new rhythm of war. Each village seized, each crossroads captured, compounds the pressure on German defenses. Eisenhower navigates this chaos with measured decisiveness, balancing urgency with the risk of overextension. Patton's audacity accelerates the Allied advance, forcing German commanders into reactive positions. Hitler's inflexibility, his obsession with holding territory and his refusal to delegate, magnifies mistakes. The collision of these visions, one of meticulous coordination, one of aggressive maneuver, one of strategic leadership, and one of fatal rigidity, shapes the unfolding campaign. By late June, the Allies have established a firm foothold in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, once considered impregnable, lies fractured. The German army is reeling. The war, long dominated by Hitler's early successes, has now entered a phase where Allied leadership, vision, and execution determine the tempo and direction of victory. The stage is set for the consequences that will ripple across Europe, the human cost of the campaign, and the strategic aftermath that will redefine the final year of the conflict. By the end of June 1944, the beaches of Normandy were no longer battlegrounds but the first strongholds of a liberated France. The cost had been staggering. Allied casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. At Omaha Beach alone, American forces suffered nearly 2,000 casualties in the first hours. The chaos of surf, sand, and steel left lasting impressions on survivors. Yet despite the bloodshed, every position seized represented a foothold in a continent long dominated by German forces. General Patton's Third Army, though not yet fully committed on D-Day itself, prepared to exploit the breaches. His rapid advances in the weeks following the landings would take the Germans by surprise, turning what had seemed a static invasion into a dynamic and accelerating campaign. Patton's emphasis on speed and maneuver leveraged the Allies' superiority in logistics, communications, and air support, turning Normandy's hedgerows into pathways of liberation. Every bridge captured, every town liberated, eroded the German defensive posture and gave hope to the millions under occupation. Eisenhower's leadership proved decisive. Coordination between American, British, and Canadian forces allowed for continuous reinforcement. Supply lines extended across the Channel, ensuring tanks, artillery, and ammunition reached the front lines. Eisenhower's decisions balanced audacity with caution, pushing forward rapidly while avoiding overextension. His ability to synthesize intelligence, coordinate multinational forces, and maintain morale under immense pressure solidified his reputation as a commander capable of orchestrating one of history's largest amphibious operations. In Berlin, Hitler's errors became painfully evident. His insistence on micromanaging divisions and refusing to release armored units until it was too late left German forces in a reactive posture. Generals on the ground, many of whom understood the tactical reality, were frustrated and increasingly demoralized. The Atlantic Wall, once touted as impenetrable, had been breached. German soldiers faced relentless bombardment from air and artillery, while morale among the civilian population began to falter. Witnessing their armies retreat under pressure they had been taught was invincible. Churchill observed the unfolding campaign from London with a mixture of relief and strategic calculation. Politically, the success of D-Day reinforced Britain's role as an indispensable partner in the Allied coalition. Strategically, it shifted the war's momentum decisively. The Germans could no longer dictate the pace. The Allies had seized the initiative. Churchill's foresight, advocating full American involvement and persistent pressure on multiple fronts, now bore fruit. Even in victory, the human cost remained stark. Thousands of soldiers would not survive the Normandy hedgerows, and countless civilians were caught in the crossfire. The liberation of France came at a price measured in lives, shattered towns, and the enduring trauma of war. Yet, strategically, the Allies now controlled the tempo. The invasion had succeeded, but it was only the opening move in a campaign that would ultimately bring Hitler's vision crashing down and reshape the fate of Europe. By July 1944, the full impact of the Normandy invasion became evident. The Allies had not only secured a foothold on continental Europe, but they had also fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Patton's armored units, unleashed across northern France, carved paths through German defenses at a speed that surprised even seasoned Allied planners. Towns fell in quick succession. Supply lines that were once secure for the Wehrmacht were now disrupted and overextended. Hitler's refusal to commit panzer divisions at the right moment left German forces scattered, forced into defensive pockets, and vulnerable to concentrated assaults. The liberation of key cities in Normandy and Brittany demonstrated the tangible consequences of strategic vision and decisiveness. Patton's aggressive maneuvers, combined with Eisenhower's orchestration of multinational forces, allowed the Allies to maintain momentum. Logistical chains ran smoothly, artillery and air support synchronized, and paratroopers cut off reinforcements behind German lines. The psychological effect on both soldiers and civilians was profound. The once feared German army was now retreating under constant pressure, while the Allies advanced with unrelenting determination. In London, Churchill's political and strategic foresight paid dividends. The success of D-Day and the ensuing campaign strengthened the United Kingdom's role in the Allied coalition, providing leverage in discussions over post-war planning and occupation. His insistence on close coordination with American and Canadian forces ensured that the liberation of Western Europe was not only a military achievement, but also a demonstration of Allied unity and resolve. For Britain, the victory reinforced national morale, proving that the sacrifices of the Blitz and the relentless German air raids had not been in vain. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler's rigid decision-making exacerbated Germany's vulnerabilities. Field commanders, demoralized and increasingly aware of the futility of rigid orders, could only delay the inevitable. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of Nazi invincibility, had been penetrated, and German resources were being depleted faster than they could be replenished. Supplies, reinforcements, and communications lagged behind the advancing Allies. Soldiers faced not only overwhelming force, but also the psychological weight of knowing that the leadership above them was disconnected from the realities on the ground. Across Europe, the human cost continued to mount. Thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured, civilians were caught in the crossfire, and entire towns bore the scars of artillery and aerial bombardment. Yet, the liberation of France marked a turning point. It demonstrated that coordinated leadership, bold strategy, and technological advantage could overcome even the most formidable defenses. The actions of Eisenhower, Patton, and Churchill, counterposed against Hitler's miscalculations, illustrated how vision, timing, and execution could determine the outcome of a global conflict. By the end of summer 1944, the Allies had secured Normandy, pushed into Brittany, and were advancing toward Paris. Germany's strategic position had deteriorated beyond repair, setting the stage for the liberation of the French capital, the eventual crossing of the Rhine, and the collapse of the Third Reich. The decisions made during those crucial weeks, from the meticulous planning in England to the audacious advances of armored columns across the French countryside, would echo across history, defining not only the outcome of the war but the nature of modern military strategy. History often remembers wars in sweeping victories and crushing defeats, yet the story of Normandy reveals a deeper truth, that outcomes are shaped as much by vision, leadership, and decisiveness as by sheer numbers or firepower. On that mist-shrouded morning of June 6, 1944, four men, Eisenhower, Patton, Churchill, and Hitler, each acted according to their convictions, their strategies, and their understanding of the world. Their choices, intersecting across continents and battlefields, determined the fates of millions. Eisenhower's calm orchestration demonstrated the power of measured judgment under pressure. Patton's audacity showcased how speed, initiative, and bold action could turn openings into breakthroughs. Churchill's insistence on coalition unity and unrelenting commitment proved that leadership extended beyond the battlefield, shaping both morale and strategy. In contrast, Hitler's rigidity and refusal to adapt highlighted the lethal consequences of inflexibility and overconfidence. The collision of these visions transformed Normandy from a tactical landing into a decisive turning point in World War II. Yet beyond strategy and politics, the human dimension remained central. Soldiers faced unimaginable danger, civilians endured terror and displacement, and every decision carried profound consequences for countless lives. The liberation of France was not merely a military success. It was a human story of courage, endurance, and the weight of responsibility borne by leaders and soldiers alike. The Normandy campaign also left a lasting legacy for warfare itself. It demonstrated the integration of intelligence, deception, logistics, and combined arms, setting a precedent for modern military operations. It proved that the outcome of war often hinges on the interplay of vision, execution, and adaptability. As history reflects on those fateful weeks, it becomes clear that the events of Normandy were shaped not only by the might of armies, but by the minds that directed them. The stories of Eisenhower, Patton, Churchill, and Hitler remind us that leadership carries consequences far beyond the battlefield, shaping nations, altering lives, and defining the course of history itself. In the calm that followed the storm, Europe's future was rewritten, and the world came to understand the profound weight of vision, courage, and responsibility.